Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here at the Providence College Podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. This week we're chatting with Marta Martínez from the class of 1979. An oral historian and nonprofit leader, Martinez is the founder and executive director of Rhode Island Latino Arts. She will receive an honorary degree at Commencement Exercises for the class of 2019. Marta, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations in advance for your honorary degree.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You're a native of El Paso, Texas. How did you choose Providence College? What brought you here?
Well, it's an interesting story because I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and we were literally on the border. When I looked out my window, we can look right across the border, and we were we couldn't afford to pay teachers, and so they recruited. At the time was called Vista Volunteers, and my junior year, 2 men from Providence College came to my school to teach. And then the senior year, another 2, so 4 of them were there, and that's all I heard about is Providence College, Rhode Island, and it just seemed like such a dream. And I had always looked to go somewhere to school. I knew I didn't want to stay in El Paso. I wanted to travel. Mainly, I wanted just to get to know the other parts of the country, and I decided that maybe the best way to do that is just to see if I can go away to school, and I applied to PC, and I got in, so here I am.
What was that experience like for you?
It was there was a big cultural shock in many ways. I discovered at the time that I was the only Latina, because that's the first thing I look for on campus, are other people who looked like myself, or the foods I missed, the music I missed. So I felt a little bit lonely in that way. The weather was another culture shock. I was not prepared at all to what New England weather brought. I didn't bring a coat. I owned one, but I didn't pack it. I had told my mom that when I came home for Christmas, I could pack my coat and bring it with me. And maybe in New England standards, and now, in fact, I'm used to the cold, but when it got down to, like, say, 50 degrees at the time was very cold for me, so I was not used to that. So the weather was one factor. And also the fact that I was so far away from home. So coming from a Mexican family, a Mexican-American family, it was, first of all, unfound that you leave home, like I did. My mother knew that I was determined and very stubborn, so she reluctantly, but she gave me her blessing, and I left. But it was hard, and I guess any freshman goes through that part of their lives when they go away from home. They get very lonely and homesick. Many of my friends that were around me at PC were able to go home. There was a lot of that going around, homesickness. They could go home the next weekend, or parents came over for parents' weekend and events like that, but I didn't have any of that. So that part was very lonely because I did miss my family. But I got through it, and I really think it was the best thing that I did to stay in PC.
How did you find kind of that how did you solve that sense of homesickness? Or
I thought about what I was doing for myself, the education part of it. I knew that I understood that having an education was very important. My parents are teachers, and they never really drilled that into me, but just simply by the fact that they were teachers, and I watched my father, who was a 5th grade teacher, and he always talked about how his students didn't have those opportunities. He eventually became a school counselor, and that was part of his job, is to make sure that kids were ready for college, and if they weren't ready for college. So he never really sat us down and told us that, but just simply by watching him go through all that. So to me, it was the idea of having an education, also learning. I was learning a lot. I was becoming a different person, and I could really feel that. And I expected to go back home when I graduated, and I wanted to bring all these new experiences with me and maybe convince other young kids behind me to come to PC. So that's what kept me going. I had that drive and that desire to go back. That didn't happen. I met my husband, who is my husband now. I met him when we were sophomores, and so that there's a history there. We got married eventually, so. But I still, I feel when I go back, I do talk about what it's like, what it was like to leave home, for somebody who hesitates and who worries about being away from home. I do share my experiences, and I encourage a lot of people, including my own kids. So I have kids who were born in Rhode Island, and when my oldest was looking in colleges, the first thing I said is you should look far away. It's a wonderful experience. It changes you, and even if you come back, and you come back a changed person, that's a good thing.
So you majored in English at PC. And what were your career aspirations then, and how did they evolve?
Well, my dream when I was younger was to be in journalism. I watched Barbara Walters when she became the first anchor. I did follow her career, and I just thought that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in television journalism. I love to write. I love to read. And since PC didn't have a journalism degree, I picked English rather than to just be undeclared or humanities. I just thought English would bring me closer to writing and reading, and I eventually did get into the broadcasting world. I had an internship when I was a junior, but I discovered that broadcast journalism was not what I liked, but writing and reading kind of stayed with me. So journalism ended up being my master's degree, but that's why I majored in English.
Take us on your path from journalism as your ambition. How did you decide, what brought you to being an oral historian?
Well, after studying how to acquiring all the tools to become a journalist, and asking questions, doing interviews, writing, and getting all the facts. When I moved back to Rhode Island, eventually I lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years when I got my master's degree at George Washington. I ended up coming back to Rhode Island, and I was hired by a Latino or Hispanic organization, and not really being familiar with the Hispanic community in Rhode Island, I went out to try to learn. And so I used to just ask people questions. It was just an instinct as a journalist just to ask questions. And I ended up finding out about a family that everybody kept pointing me to, and I went to see her. It was a woman and her family, and I just sat down and I started asking her questions, and just basically what I discovered from her, that she was one of the first Dominicans in Rhode Island. I just felt that there was something there that I wanted to continue, especially after I interviewed her. I went to the library and Historical Society and looked for other resources that would kind of give me a foundation so I can learn more about the Hispanic community, and there was nothing there. Nothing outside of articles in the newspaper that were not necessarily positive about Latinos, mostly the crimes that they had been arrested for, nothing positive. And so what I decided is that I wanted to build that history, and putting together my interview skills and my curiosity, my longing to learn more about this family and what happened after they came to Rhode Island in 1955. I just set out to talk to more people, and so out of that came my training. It's more of a not formal training, but it led me to becoming what I call a community or oral historian.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of Latino immigration to Rhode Island? What were the patterns of immigration, and how have they changed over the years? So
going back to that first family, they moved here in 1955, and to me that's tangible. It's during my time, so I started to think about what that meant. Is that anybody who came to Rhode Island after that, 1955, was probably still alive if this woman who I first met was here. So that's really what was the most fascinating thing, is that I did meet people who were like the firsts of Rhode Island, the first Puerto Rican who came, the first police officer, the first lawyer, the first judge. So there was a path that they were carving for the Latinos today. But that, thinking back to my own Mexican heritage, and if I were ever to to look for it, it's not there. It's in the dirt. I walk on it. I walk on my own history in California. But here, just the idea that people were still here to share their stories and what it was like. And I connected also with those stories, the stories of isolation, the stories of it was cold when I first came here. I miss my food. I miss speaking Spanish. I kind of felt that I was in their shoes. I was not an immigrant from another country, but I was an outsider that had moved to Rhode Island. So that's what's been driving me. It's just that the stories that are so similar, that they all share, whether you come from Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, even Puerto Rico, you're considered American. It's a territory of the U.S., but they still share those same stories, and it just drove me to keep searching. And I feel like that's a never-ending job. Every day I look to see if there's another person out there that I can learn something from, whether it's that they came back in the 50s or whether they just arrived yesterday. Those stories are all similar and they're very powerful. So the largest and the first community that came here were the Dominicans. The Puerto Ricans also came soon after that. The Colombians, and most of the reasons why they came were very similar. They were job related. They were looking for work. Today, when I talk to immigrants, Latinos or any immigrant, they're looking for better opportunities for their families. It's not work, but in the early days, it was all work related. Rhode Island had a lot of jobs, and primarily industrial jobs. They came to do textile work. They came to work in the jewelry factories, lace factories. So it was that kind of work, and there were a lot of jobs. So there was that story too, is finding that you had doctors and architects coming, and they found themselves doing the same kind of work as the person next to them in doing industrial work. So it's very fascinating to see how we all bring something with us that could enrich the United States and the state, and yet because of just either it's a language barrier or a cultural barrier, we're all put into the same place. And I never really felt that way when I was at PC, but it was a lonely feeling that you couldn't find somebody else here who just even looked like you, and understood why you were lonely or why you missed your food and those kinds of things.
But the ability for you to interview these folks, because these firsts are still happening. And it wasn't too long ago before Providence had its first Latino mayor. It's really fascinating that this is happening now, whereas in other parts of the country, centuries, in Texas.
Exactly. That's what fascinated me, because from where I came, that everything was bilingual, billboards, newspapers, and here there was none of that. And that's the other thing that I first noticed, is that I couldn't find even a Spanish language newspaper. And so for all that thing to kind of unfold, 1955 and forward, the first Latino mayor, and even when I was here in the 70s and the 80s, there was no Spanish language newspapers, and it took a long time for all those things to happen. And it was history. I think of those things as historical. People think those things are mundane, but they're important, that when you are able to create something that makes the people around you feel at home, to feel like they're part of the community, where you can pick up a Spanish language newspaper and read about what's going on in Rhode Island, not necessarily outside of the country and the world, but in Rhode Island, and you can understand what's happening, and it just helps you, it gives you an opportunity to participate in voting and in just learning about what's around you.
It's kind of like the infrastructure of a community. It's one of the signs, it seems
right.
like. I'm curious because it seems like so much of the work that you've done has been related to place as much as the people. It's especially looking at some of the tours that you've given some of the communities, and how these communities are tied to places. For example, Dexter Street in Central Falls. I'm curious if there are some of the key points of those tours that you share with the communities, and are there parts of those communities that you can point to and say, this is kind of evidence of how the community evolved in these areas?
Well, that was the way I used to give the tours. I've been giving these tours very informally on Broad Street, and that was part of it. I wanted to point out places that are significant to Latinos, like the first Spanish language church, the church building that provided that, the first Spanish restaurant, and then the market. It was the bodega. The family that opened the first bodega were that Dominican family that moved here. So there were sites and tangible places I can point to, but I also discovered that there were people around me who can tell that story much better than I, because they lived there, they shopped there, they went to school there, and they just were part of that community. So that's what the tours that I give. I invite people who live there to give the tours from their own perspective, and every time they give the tour, it's different. I have one that's scripted because I've done all the research, and for me it's important to reveal that history, and so I share that history. But to hear about a location where someone used to or does their hair, and where they went to school, and where you can buy the best plátanos or the best coffee. I think if it's told from the people who live there, it's more meaningful. It makes them feel important. It makes them also better appreciate their neighborhoods. And I think it empowers them. And part of the subtle work that I'm trying to do is empower people. So if there's change proposed, if the city believes that they should bring something to a neighborhood, I think that they should talk to the people who live there before they bring it. That doesn't always happen. So part of what's happening is that the folks who are giving the tours are being empowered, and they're understanding how important a place is. And they hear that there's a chance that place may disappear, or if it may change, if it may start looking differently than what the neighborhood looks like, if it stands out. Hopefully that they'll be empowered to speak up and speak out.
If we talk more about empowerment, because so much of your work has also been tied to education. You've taught at many grade levels. You've taught here at PC through some of the Feinstein Institute courses in global studies and in public and community service studies. So I'm curious how education can, the types of education that you're working in, can empower people and the different kind of routes for education. Well,
just thinking back to why I came here, education. I had never really thought of what that meant to me. First it was it really was an adventure. I wanted to go to school, and the idea of going far away was exciting, but the power of having a degree and having it from a good institution that's well known, I and my parents having just being teachers and just almost just wearing that informal badge on their shoulders, I think it's very important that the message goes out to young people that education is the key. If you don't have a degree, you can be smart, you can have a trade, and that's fine. But I unfortunately, in today's world, without a degree, without an education, you really can't get, as far as maybe, to provide for, financially provide for yourself. I encourage anyone who is looking for an education just to fight for it. And I also work with young kids who are desperate to have an education but just don't have the immigration status. So that's one way that I encourage others to look at education, is to support those who aren't able to get it as much as they want it. I try to empower kids who don't have their immigration status here just to keep going, to fight for it, to not give up if they feel like there's some kind of a barrier in the way. But that's the key, is just to keep encouraging everyone, whether it's the young kids who are looking for a degree and those who are teachers or who are advocating for education, just that to make sure that that's the message, that the key to life is a good education.
And one of the first projects I spoke to you about when you were working at here at PC was Welcoming Rhode Island. There were PC students who were interviewing immigrants to the state and finding out more about their stories. Could you tell us a little bit how the students benefited from an experience like that?
I think what was wonderful about that experience is that some of those kids had never been off campus. And I think that's what happens in general. You read about something in a book and you learn about it, but unless you are able to experience, you don't fully understand it. So those kids had never really been off campus. They were exposed to a variety of diverse individuals. So it wasn't just Latinos, but individuals from India, from Brazil, Portugal, and they learned more about not just an individual person, but about Rhode Island and how diverse it is, and how it is made up of wonderful professionals who have a lot to offer. But I think that's the greatest takeaway that I saw from the students who went out to interview of the individuals that they did.
And that project has continued for several years, and I think some of the interviewees some of the subjects have even been Providence College faculty members, which is very fascinating.
Right, and that they discovered that they're right under their nose, and they never thought about what they contribute just to the Providence College family. I believe one year that we even had the reception here, which was also wonderful. So those kids who went out to learn about the individuals brought those individuals here, and they were able to learn more about the kids and what their surroundings are like.
What were some of the techniques that you shared with the students? I mean, you talked about how you were self-taught, essentially, in terms of oral history, but what were some of the techniques or tips that you were able to share with students too?
Just very basic interview 101, how, we talk about what kinds of questions to ask, how to follow up, very just basic stuff. But I think I do spend some time talking about what it's like when you talk to someone who's an immigrant in particular, the kinds of questions to ask. So there's some cultural sensitivity questions, how to phrase them so that you aren't seeming like you're, maybe being discriminatory or so basically just to think carefully about the kinds of questions you ask and how you phrase them makes a difference. So that was the difference outside of what kinds of questions to ask that aren't leading or that get you the right answer.
Are there things when considering Rhode Island's Latino history that surprise people that they didn't realize, or when you're sharing these elements of history?
I think just that I've said is that the Latino community is so young, and that it took that long for a Latino mayor to be elected. And we do share the growth that is seen around the country. We are the largest and the fastest growing population in the state. What people don't realize is that how diverse it is. Every single country is represented. There are 21 Latin American countries, and every single one of them is represented in Rhode Island. And they're everywhere. People think that they're all concentrated in Providence, the urban settings, Central Falls, Pawtucket, maybe Woonsocket, but they're in places you wouldn't realize. They're in Westerly, they're in North Kingstown, Newport, places like that. I think that's the most surprising thing, is how diverse and how they're everywhere in Rhode Island. They're doing great things in Rhode Island.
I think one of the most interesting projects, in just looking through your history and things, the different varying things you've done, the project at the Providence Children's Museum seemed the most intriguing. And could you tell us about that and how you designed and planned that? So
after discovering this history of the Latinos and this particular family that I keep going back to, the Rosarios who opened the first bodega, I just think that was such an important turning point in Rhode Island, not just in the Latino community, that this family came here and they chose Rhode Island and they opened a marketplace, and it reflects what everybody says is, I miss my own food. I had no place to shop where I could buy my food. And so they just decided to open one themselves. And it was because of that family that the Latino community grew. They helped settle people. They brought people from New York. They physically drove to New York to get the food to put in their bodega. And when they went to New York, they would talk about Providence in particular, and people were interested, so they would hop in their car and they'd drive back, and and they liked it so much, so they literally built the community that exists today. So that story to me, because it's so important, that has touched so many individuals, not just the Dominican community, but the Guatemalan community was touched by her, the Colombians, simply because it was a bodega, a place to shop and a place to eat, and a place where you can read your newspaper in Spanish and walk in and speak Spanish. It was home when you walked in her door. I want to keep that history and that story alive. So the idea of setting up something in a building, in an institution that reaches young people, young Latinos who don't know about that history, and non-Latinos who I really think need to understand what that story is. The Children's Museum, I thought, was a perfect place to set up a little bodega. And the director at the time was making some changes in the museum. They have a section called Coming to America, and they have exhibits that represent different ethnic groups or that have made a change in Rhode Island, and they were about to change it up. And we spoke about something that would be impactful to add to the museum. And so I suggested Fefa's Market, which is what that exhibit is called. So when you actually go in there, it doesn't feel exactly like you're in her bodega, but she came with me, Fefa. When I was putting it together, I brought her in to be my advisor, and she literally told me exactly how to set it up so that when you walked in, the cash register is in one place, the food that you put in your baskets in a particular place. It's a very miniature version, but right down to that point, the fact that she was alive and there to help me put it together. And to me, it just represents something that's tangible, that's hopefully will be there a very long time, that will represent that very important history that the Latinos have brought to Rhode Island, and that those children of the children who Fefa brought to Rhode Island will always be able to connect to it. And if they don't know the story, I think they should know it. And what better way to learn it but in a very fun and enjoyable and way than the Children's Museum.
Marta, could you tell us more about Fefa? Is there anything that stands out with her story or any connections to PC?
Actually, there is a wonderful story that I love to share, and that's after Fefa and her husband Tony arrived to Rhode Island. What they did is they drove down Broad Street, and they were looking for the Latino community. They wanted to just see who else lived here that they could connect with. And they walked up to a police officer and they asked him, well, where are the Hispanic people, the Spanish-speaking people? And he didn't know. He couldn't think of anyone. So then they said, well, how about any Dominicans? And so he knew of Dominicans. He actually pointed them towards Smith Hill and towards Providence College, which is obviously where the Dominicans are. But they had no idea. They were very excited, thinking that there was another Dominican community here. But as it turns out, that particular Dominican community was the best thing that ever happened to her. Is when she came to PC, she met Father Ruba, who became her biggest champion. When she got here, he helped them find a place to live. He later on, when they first were bringing other Dominicans to Rhode Island, when they would drive back to New York and come back with food to fill their bodega, they needed to find blankets and utensils and things like that they didn't have. And Father Ruba was the biggest champion, and she talked about him until the day she passed, that she really was grateful for the Dominicans that helped a Dominican family get settled and help build a Dominican community in Rhode Island. That's my favorite story I really have to share.
That's fantastic how the Dominicans help the Dominicans and vice versa. Marta, it has been wonderful talking with you this morning. Thank you so much for sharing your history in Rhode Island and then the history of the Latino communities here. Subscribe to the Providence College Podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and our newest platform, Spotify. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.